This is a brief response to Fighting Atheist's video, How to Convert an Atheist, in which Fighting Atheist provides a list of supposed evidences that would convert an honest atheist. But I disagree, namely because this is not a debate of evidence. This is a debate of worldviews. This is a conflict in which two beliefs, atheism and Christianity, or atheism versus the Bible, are in conflict. It is about a starting point, not a deduction based on evidence. We filter evidence through our worldview. So it is our very worldview that is in conflict, our belief system by which we filter and interpret the evidence. Fighting Atheist takes the neutral stance, the supposed neutral stance, that there is this neutral position in which the atheist is willing to accept evidence in order to make a logical deduction, as if atheism is a logical deduction after the fact and not an assumption before the fact. But we see that this is really a myth. This is the myth of neutrality, because atheism is not a neutral position by any means. I mean, after all, many times the atheist says, well, you can't use the Bible and you can't speak about the supernatural. In fact, the atheist is pitted himself against God and against the claims of the Bible, and by definition, that is not neutral. So we have to immediately discard and dispense with this myth of neutrality. Let's be honest. Atheism is not neutral, and neither is Christianity. Both have presuppositions, be it biblical presuppositions or natural presuppositions, Christian presuppositions or empirical presuppositions, that both sides of this conflict are holding on to and interpreting the evidence through. You see, both sides, be it the biblical worldview or the atheistic worldview, will invoke rescuing devices to save their worldview. We see this happen, for instance, in Fighting Atheist's video. He doesn't get more than 3 minutes into the video in which he uses one of these rescuing devices. Notice how this happens. He claims that one of the evidences he will accept are verified specific prophecies that could not have been contrived. So what is the rescuing device? If you offer one of the many prophecies that the Bible gives, one of the 48 prophecies, for instance, of Jesus Christ's first coming, let alone the many more that it talks about history and world empires, etc., etc., but when you give that, the rescuing device that Fighting Atheist has at his disposal is he could claim those were contrived. And so he is safe, and his worldview remains intact for any prophecy you give, be it the virgin birth of Christ, or the birthplace of Christ, or the time of Christ's birth, or one of these prophecies that defy probability. He could simply say, well, those were contrived. They were made up. You see, so this rescuing device leaves his atheism intact. And atheism is clearly demonstrated to not be a deduction, but a presupposition. Not a finishing point, but a starting point. And I confess, the Christian does this too. Oftentimes the Christian will be presented with things he or she cannot explain or even cannot understand with our limited 3-pound brain. But we rely on the presupposition that God is greater than our thoughts, and He has an explanation and a reason for things that we don't always have a reason for. So we both rely on presuppositions, and we both have these rescuing devices. So the question is not where is the evidence, but which worldview provides what we could call the preconditions of intelligibility. Which belief system gives us a universe where knowledge makes sense and is possible? Which provides things like morality, logic, and science? Which makes those possible? Which leads to knowledge? Which worldview, for instance, makes sense of ethics and absolute morality? A universe in which there is a holy, infinite God who judges right and wrong, and therefore provides a basis for right and wrong and for calling things right and wrong, or a universe of blind random chance? Which makes sense of morality? Which provides a rational basis for choosing right and wrong? If everything is just chance, how do you decide right from wrong? But if there is a holy, infinite God who is absolute and true, then you have a basis for right and wrong. Which worldview makes sense of logic and truth? The very fact that we can debate this issue presupposes that there is a truth at which we can arrive, that knowledge is possible, that we can reason with one another and persuade one another towards a truth. Which makes sense of that? A God of truth who told us to reason with him in his word in order to reach the truth because he is the truth? Or a universe of chemistry where we are controlled by unguided natural processes, which we are reacting, in which, for example, our genes are just genetically predisposing what we'll do. Does biology make sense? Can we learn if we're just a biological equation or chemical equation? Or can we learn if God has given us dignity and free will in order to choose, persuade, reason, logic, in order to reach a truth? Which makes sense of this? Finally, in order to do science, we must assume that there is a constancy in nature. We must assume, for example, that what goes up on Monday will also go up and then come down on Tuesday. That experiment we do on Wednesday will, under the same conditions, give us the same result on Thursday. Which makes sense of this uniformity in nature? A God of power, who promised to uphold all things by the word of his power, including natural cycles in Genesis 8:22, or a universe of flux and change and constant evolution in which we can never be sure if our senses are even telling us the right thing, if our memory is telling us the right thing. How do we know that the experiment and the rules of nature will be the same tomorrow as they were today if we do not have a God of power in control? You see, which worldview leads to knowledge? The Bible tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. God gave us the faculty and the presuppositions, the morality, the logic, the uniformity in nature, so we can arrive at knowledge. He told us in his word to learn of him, so he would give us the presuppositions in order to have a universe in which knowledge is possible. But how does that work in atheism, in which everything is relative or non-existent or in flux? You see, atheism, if you follow it through, leads to absurdity. It cannot lead to knowledge. An atheist is arbitrary. Atheism is inconsistent, and atheism is unable to provide for an intelligible universe because it cannot provide rationally a basis for morality, for logic, for science, despite the claims to the contrary. To know anything, then, the atheist unwittingly, and they wouldn't confess this, must rely on biblical presuppositions. He or she must assume that there is a truth that they can reach. They must assume the laws of nature in order to do science. They must assume that there is a right and wrong in order to make a moral decision. Hence, atheism, as a worldview, is self-refuting because it cannot even stand on its own presuppositions in order to know anything. That's why I could never be an atheist. That's why atheism is absurd. It's not about the evidence, fighting atheist or viewer. It's about your worldview. It's not where you finish and what deductions you make based on a certain list of evidences that are provided. It's about where you're starting. Are you starting with God being possible, or are you starting with your heart already closed? Because whatever evidence we put forth, ultimately it will be filtered through your worldview. So, does your worldview make knowledge possible, or does it degenerate into absurdity? Because Jesus said, even if they were presented with someone who rose again from the dead, that person would not believe if they do not accept that God is true, if they do not accept the biblical presuppositions that ultimately lead to knowledge.